You're listening to Tech Society FM, a podcast about all the facets of technology and our society, giving you our take on things and interviewing people that are doing important things. Now here's your hosts, Alex Dunmo and John Nguyen.
Hey techies, welcome to another episode of Tech Society. Today we're talking with our good friend and data guru, Keith McCormick. Keith fills us in on the data science in play by Nate Silver's 538 website, which uses statistical analysis and hard numbers to predict the outcome of the US election. Right on the dawn of the election, we look at the polling data and we realize it's really not as clear-cut as everyone would like to believe.
So let's start. Okay, let's just roll straight into it. Tell us about 538. What is 538? Why is that number relevant to people who probably don't know?
Oh,
Tell us about the project.
That itself is pretty interesting, isn't it? 538 is the number of votes in the Electoral College. So the way things work in U.S. elections is each of the states, based on population, gets a certain number of what are called these electoral votes. So technically, when I vote here in North Carolina, I'm not directly casting a vote for president. I'm casting a vote that tells the electors of North Carolina how to vote. And there was actually some debate back in 2016 on whether or not they were allowed to, if they felt for some reason that they wanted to do their own thing, if they were allowed to, and they're actually just required. So it's kind of an odd formality, but it goes back all the way to the earliest years of the U.S. when they were trying to decide whether or not the people should vote for president directly or if Congress should. And the feeling was if Congress did, then that would give that branch of government too much power. So they tried to find a compromise position between the two.
The actual choice to put their electoral vote forward is one of tradition, isn't it? That there is no legal pressure on them to actually vote the way that people vote.
Oh no, I think it is. It is in law, but one of the things that's even though, because I know this from traveling internationally, U.S. politics follows me when I travel internationally because there's so many things that obviously the impact of the U.S. on Europe, but also Pacific Rim and everywhere, as you know. So whether or not they're allowed to, no, they are actually required. But something that a lot of folks probably don't know about the U.S. unless they've lived here is how different the states are. I don't just mean, culturally or in terms of the vibe that's here, but, the legal implications. So when I was an undergrad, even someone close enough in age as my older sister, who's 8 years older than me, when she was in college, drinking age was 18. But then the drinking age was increased to 21. So if you think about, college age, obviously, that's kind of the difference between being able to drink when you're a freshman and being able to drink when you're a senior. Not something I think a lot about now, but it was something that was on my mind at the time, So two states, when I was an undergrad, there were two states that had not changed that rule. One was the adjacent state to me, and the other one was, Louisiana. So speed limits can be different by state. Things like drinking age can be different by state. And how votes are counted can be different by state. Everybody gets one vote, but the actual process of how it's done, because each of the 50 states has a secretary of state who's in charge of that. So for instance, during COVID, there's been a move to try to make it more convenient and more safe to vote. So something like 112,000 people in Texas have voted from their cars. They pull up, they go into a particular lane. And then there's been a court case quite recently, just over the last couple of days, challenging that, saying that it might be unconstitutional to vote in your car. In that way. It sounds a little funny to put it that way because you kind of picture James Madison and George Washington and everything debating about COVID-19 and voting in your car. But the point is that the specific things, there was also a challenge to drop-off boxes where you could get a mail-in ballot, and rather than having to worry about sending it through the post and possibly having it be delayed because of the huge number of ballots that are being sent through the post now, there'd be drop-off boxes. But then there was a debate as to who was in charge of these drop-off boxes and how many of them there could be, and this differs by state, more so I think than people again would appreciate unless they've spent quite a bit of time here as a resident.
And so the importance of the Electoral College as far as predicting the outcome of the election is there was a lot of, all the polls were saying Hillary Clinton was going to win in a landslide, right? Turns out she lost.
Yeah.
She won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. And there wasn't many people at the time simulating that kind of polling for that outcome.
Yeah, so that kind of brings us back to 538 and Nate Silver. So the quick version on 2016 is the polls weren't off as much as the reputation. Clearly they were, okay? But Clinton did win by, I think it's 3 million, votes in the popular vote. So I think the polls were saying that she was going to win by something like 53% of the popular vote, and she got something more like 52. That's just from memory. I could be wrong there, but it's only off by about a point. So, it's kind of interesting. I have a lesson in my UC Irvine course where I use the 2016 election. And you can imagine I've got to be careful with that content because I don't want the discussion forum to be, become this political thing that, Clinton should have won because of whatever, or of course she was going to lose because she felt this way about policy, whatever. So I have to warn everybody that we're trying to understand the math and the projection, not that.
Yeah.
But
then we're going to lock this episode to that kind of discussion.
Yeah. So
I think there's. Yeah, we've already done an episode with a political commentator, and all the that angle of politics is pretty much covered everywhere you look. But the data side is very interesting. And sorry,
no, absolutely no. And I had I noticed that as well. But I think it's so interesting to get this piece, and I find it fascinating to go back periodically, about once a year or whatever, to the videos that the staff at 538 recorded just before the 2016 election, about a week before. Because the reason I use this as a lesson in my UC Irvine course is not just how to deal with uncertainty in the calculations, but how to communicate it to management. And that's what I think is really fascinating. So what I do is I ask them, because this is an informal thing, it's just a discussion forum. They're not writing a dissertation on this. It's a stats class, so this is something that we have to be able to do an assignment where in less than an hour they've checked out some content and they go into a discussion forum. So I asked them to give a letter grade, A through F, on how well 538 dealt with the uncertainty in their calculations, but then another grade on how well they communicated that to their audience. And it's actually kind of ironic how this turns out, because it ends up being that their reaction to the content, in a sense, gives the real grade more than the grade that they say that they're going to give. What I mean by that is if they give a grade, but they seem to be confused by what 538 was trying to say in 2016, that itself becomes a data point. And that, of course, is very common. So they'll say, oh, well, they seem to have this fancy formula. And I think by implication, some of them don't really understand how the formula worked, but they'll say, well, they seem to have this fancy formula, so I'll give them a B for trying to account for uncertainty, but clearly they were wrong. So, I'll give them, an F for that. But what I'll do is sometimes I'll just go on the forum, and I don't want to put my thumb on the scale on how they think about it because I'm trying to get that information out of them, but I'll just simply ask, did you check out how many states were right and how many states were wrong? So as you know, in the international press, it's well reported that the polls were, a disaster, right? Same here domestically. But 538 only got 3 states wrong out of 47. I'm sorry, 3 wrong and 47 right. And apparently the number of votes cast that tipped the scales in those 3 states collectively was only about 60,000. It was just this remarkably small number. Those were all super, super close. So what that kind of brings us to is I think the value of doing this more granular prediction and then rolling it up. So at the risk of sounding like we're going down a different rabbit hole, I bet you two and a lot of folks in the audience are probably familiar with IBM's Cognos software, the business intelligence software. It's called, Cognos. So Cognos has this feature called spreading, where what you can do is you can do this big forecast, like my sales across the whole company and all product lines, for next month, and then spread that out to the different product lines. So if product line A is 4% of sales, it's going to get 4% of the big forecast. And if product line B is 7.5% of sales, it's going to get 7% of the whole forecast. And that's the way typically forecasts have been done. You do the big forecast, which analogous, here would be the popular vote. And you just kind of carve that out, by state. But I think what 538 shows is that as long as you've got the computing power to do it, doing lots of more granular forecasts and then rolling them up is safer. And that's essentially what they do. People think that they're doing some kind of manipulation of the popular vote and then weighting that by state or something, but they're doing state polls. They're doing everything at the state level. But then they have to combine all those state predictions in some way. So, of course, they don't write the formula out, but you get a pretty good sense if you check out the website of what's going on. And Nate Silver is an interesting character in and of himself. He started out as a semi-pro poker player when he was in his 20s, and then he was really into sports betting. So the sports network, I don't know how well known it is outside of the US, ESPN, all the sports commentary on the big teams here, they're the ones that bought out his website. So in a sense, his boss is ESPN, but he keeps the political
ESPN
part.
owns 5. Oh, so that was separate. So he had the same kind of data science perspective on sports.
Oh, if you go to the homepage, you click on politics or you click on sports.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I think it's I think that the sports might even be kind of the one that pays the bills, but he's become famous for the political, because back in I don't know how many elections ago, probably maybe 16 years ago now or something like that, he got all but one congressional race right, but that's how he's doing it. He's doing granular and then rolling it up. And I think the lesson for data scientists in general is that's a pretty good way of doing things, as long as you've got the computing power. Do a forecast by individual product line and then aggregate it, rather than doing a big forecast and then spreading it out, by share of the market, by product line. You usually end up with a better result. Because again, the polls have this reputation where it was just complete mess, but they were only wrong about 3 states.
Which is actually a pretty good result.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there it is. Okay, so again, everybody said, well, complete and utter fail, but it did. The forecast at the time did give President Trump almost 30%. Okay, and the states where they were wrong become somewhat famous here was Pennsylvania. Right now, notice. It only gave Trump 23% in Pennsylvania, so it's not that it was a close call. So clearly the polling error in Pennsylvania was pretty bad. But there was one county in particular, in fact, Ben Bradley Jr., who's an older gentleman now, but is the son of another famous Ben Bradley Sr., who was the editor of the Washington Post during the Nixon era. When the Washington Post broke that news story. So it's a famous, journalism family. And he wrote a whole book about one county in Pennsylvania and did a whole bunch of interviews there to find out why that particular county supported, Trump, because that county, that one little part of Pennsylvania was enough to tip the scales with how it went. And then Michigan and Wisconsin were both surprises. So if we were to look at the current one, what you would see is that Michigan and Wisconsin, pretty much no one is predicting now that that's going to be Trump, again. And the really big states are the state that I live in, North Carolina, which is actually, this was forecasted, that went Trump as well, but notice that it was 55, 45 here, right? And Florida is a purple state. So this is where the controversy comes in, because some people think that we should switch to just do a popular vote and disband the Electoral College. That gets really complicated. It probably would require a constitutional amendment, which is a very elaborate, complicated thing to do. But the other thing is, I have some reservations about it. I mean, you have everything about the elections is built around this. And if you took California, New York, and Texas alone, just those three states, I don't know what fraction of the U.S. population would be, but it would be somewhere around 35, 40%, probably just those three states. So you've got to think that if there was an electoral college, that everything would then be big TV, events, this kind of retail politics, which is still something that they, do, particularly during the primaries, going out in buses and shaking hands and going to pancake breakfasts and all this kind of crazy stuff. It's unclear how much that would, that would change. But what's also fascinating, and then this is what gave me a little bit of pause that things might have been turning back before, is this kind of famous snake chart. They call it. It's a little bit odd looking, so I'll kind of orient everybody to it. It's become kind of a famous chart. But the darker color means that there's really no debate as to who's to win in that state. So, for instance, in Wyoming, some of these other states, it's almost inconceivable. Let's click on Wyoming, for instance. Look at that. And that there was no surprise there. That's what would have been predicted back then and would still be predicted. California famously is, a blue state. North Carolina, where I live, is considered a purple state. And you'll kind of see why. So what really becomes the issue is these states in the middle. And if you notice, you don't have to have very many states turn pink to get to the line, because Florida is right there. Right? So again, in the popular vote, you would think, well, Trump didn't have a chance. But look, just that one state gets you halfway to the line, which is what would tip the scales in the electoral vote. So it's really kind of a fascinating little chart. And if we look at the equivalent of that for now, and this alone is kind of an interesting thing. See, what they do is they use bootstrapping, which is a little bit hard to describe verbally, but the basic idea is what the chances are in each state based on the latest polls. So you can picture pulling the handle on a slot machine, just say, if the chances are 55 one way and 45 the other, then if you do that 40,000 times, which is the number of simulations they do, sometimes that state will go to the one that it's leaning towards, but sometimes it will go to the other candidate. Well, you do that for all the states, and you do all these different simulations. And you can see that in this round, there's not that many scenarios where Trump can win. And notice that for Trump to win, this is my state over here, right below the white area is North Carolina, because just north of me is Virginia, and of course Washington D.C. and the Northeast. So notice that the scenarios where Trump is going to win always have to include North Carolina, and that's going to be interesting because my state is one of the three states that everybody is talking about. Everybody has their eyes on. Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida are probably going to be the ones that make the difference here. So if we scroll down to that state, and then see, here's the 40,000 scenarios. And notice that there's one in gray, because there is a scenario, not likely, but there is a scenario where they'd be tied. And if they're tied, it goes to Congress. It's so fun for me that you guys nod every time this obscure, because it's obviously the U.S. election, they get all this international coverage, that this, when it's tied, it goes to Congress. The two of you nodded right away, which means that somehow the whole world is getting educated on these obscure, bizarre things.
I would say, in all honesty, the average Australian knows more about the US election than our own election. And that's even doubly interesting when you realize that Australians are actually compelled to vote.
Yeah, that's true.
But we definitely know more about US politicians than Australian politicians. We know more about the state of US politics than we know about our own politics. It's also because Trump's in power, right? And he is.
It's more drama, really.
Yeah, for way more
It's more
drama,
exciting
yeah.
to.
Our politicians are fairly boring.
Yeah, it's true.
They are career politicians. They you just hope that the one you voted for is less of a bastard, than the other one.
It's less of a spectacle as well. I think you find like even not just Trump, but the Biden side is very, very big on how do you say it? Winning the popularity of the people, hearts and minds of the people. Whereas over here it's more dry. You kind of vote for a party.
No, I think here the party will basically be in for a certain amount of time, and then everyone's just sick of their shit, and we have a swap. That's generally what happens here. Yeah.
Well,
I love this website though.
In a parliamentary system, I guess it just feels differently because you're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we also have the parliamentary system means that when a leader loses popularity and loses the confidence of their own party, that party gets rid of them. And in the last decade, we've had like three leadership changes that don't require the general public to be involved in that at all.
Yeah.
It's decided entirely by the party. So, someone like Trump just wouldn't be able to actually maintain power here. His own party would, yeah.
Well, it just occurred to me that, another difference is you're not voting for all the positions on the same day. Because of that, a vote of no confidence could happen anytime, but here everything is on election day. And I think the importance of that is that most senators and congressmen do feel, if they're Republican, they feel very much beholden to Trump, because Trump will tweet, that he doesn't care for a particular senator or congressman, and it's all part of the same election cycle. And there have been some noteworthy instances, in 2018, where if he withdrew his personal support, they would lose. Or his former attorney general lost in the primary because Trump tweeted that he preferred the person that was running against him, in the primary. So that's a dynamic that you wouldn't have if the head of state and the representatives aren't all part of the same process, all building up on the same day, kind of like an election season, like we have here. But that, so again, it was striking that you guys recognize that kind of obscure thing too, because that really hasn't happened since the early 19th century. There was John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, and I think the sixth president. So this would be 1820-ish. Something, like that had to get worked out in Congress. That election, there's this whole famous story, the corrupt bargain. I would be taxing my memory to remember all the details. But there was a real controversy that when it went to Congress, this behind the scenes, kind of drama, trying to position people. And by trying to win over some votes, made a promise about cabinet positions and so on. That was the, that was the story. It was all behind closed doors, so no one knows for sure, right? But that would be a real mess. That would be, I don't even know how long that would take to resolve that if the little gray dot were to happen. But here's the snake diagram that we were just talking about, and this is something I stared at quite a bit. Naturally living here, I'm, very curious about what's going to happen. So if you look at it here, I think this looks rather different than the last one, in that now Pennsylvania is the one that's on the fence. But you can see, for instance, that Georgia, which is absolutely a red state, is showing slight advantage to Biden. The other thing that they do, which is interesting, is that what you would see in the newspapers typically is the latest poll. Could be a poll that came out, last night. That's not what 538 does. 538 does a weighted average of all the polls. It gives the more recent a little bit more weight. It's all in the secret sauce. Nobody knows exactly how much. But that average helps keep it stable. But what's been interesting about this, in contrast to 2016, is one, it's not changing much. And two, there's more states in between. And the states are more geographically diverse, because if you're doing this bootstrapping slot machine thing that I was describing, and then you're using Bayesian statistics to do a mashup of all these different states, one of the reasons that Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania were a big surprise is that they're not that far from each other geographically. They're all kind of part of what is often called the Rust Belt, called that because of, closed factories and automotive industry and so on. It's all in that neck of the woods, and not, kind of in coal country too, although that's more West Virginia, but you get the idea. They're not that different from each other. So the Bayesian statistic business assumes that all of these events are independent, that Michigan is independent of Wisconsin, is independent of Pennsylvania. But as Nate Silver pointed out shortly after the 2016 election, the math makes that assumption, but in the real world, that assumption isn't really met. That if Michigan is shifting, Wisconsin's probably shifting with it, because these folks live in neighboring states. But here, these states are all over the place. North Carolina and Florida are both south of the Mason-Dixon line, the border during the Civil War, but they're really quite different, in many ways. Arizona is about as far away from Florida as you can get. Pennsylvania is more in that Rust Belt state, you see. So here, maybe that assumption of independence is a little bit stronger. So if you look at this from a different point of view, it's really pretty cool. They've taken the 40,000 simulations and they've done this. So again, dark blue is definitely going to be Biden and dark red is definitely going to be Trump. But in between, you can say, well, since I live in North Carolina, for instance, what if North Carolina goes to Trump? Well, then Trump's odds increase. But if North Carolina goes to Biden, Biden's won. And this is because there are a lot more dark blue right now than there are dark red. A lot of the states that would normally be dark red are pink. They're on the fence. So Biden is going in with more guaranteed than Trump is. So that's why Trump is in a bit of a tough spot. He has to win all of those borderline cases, and they're all over the place. So again, if they were contiguous, it's just like a coin toss. You flip a coin once. The second coin toss has nothing to do with the first coin toss, but that assumption's not met if they're neighboring states. Then the coin tosses are not independent of each other. But again, look at a lot of these pink states, like look at Texas, for instance, which is absolutely a red state, but in this election cycle is behaving more like a purple state. If Biden wins in Texas, it's game over. So the states that are really getting a lot of attention are North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Florida. But it's more complicated than all of that, because we mentioned earlier that, driver's licenses, drinking age, all that stuff differs by state. So since the logistics of counting votes is different, which we mentioned already, when we'll know the answer is different by state. So in Florida, which was where that whole year 2000 Bush versus Gore goes to the Supreme Court, big drawn out thing that took, I think, 36 days, if memory serves, something like that. It was, pretty stressful thing. The country had never experienced anything quite like that before. So Florida now,
I think there was 150,000 votes in that, wasn't it?
Oh gosh,
in Florida,
150. Yeah, I think it absolutely could have been. As a percentage, I remember that it was super, super tiny because Florida has more than 10 million. Gosh, I don't even know. I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know, but there's so many, all the states, all those populations to memorize. Yeah, but
I'm I'm really into US politics, I must admit. So
yeah,
I consume a lot.
Well, and Florida is fascinating because the Latino vote in Florida has been getting a lot of attention because tens of thousands of folks that had until recently lived in Puerto Rico, but that after the devastation of the hurricane moved to Florida.
Of course, yeah.
Many of them felt that Trump was very dismissive of what was going on, and that it's not really a state, and it's a U.S. territory. There was a lot of this kind of talk, which really the residents of Puerto Rico really didn't care for. They felt like that the federal government didn't do enough to help them out. So as you can imagine, would be a tendency in that group to vote against Trump, but Cuban Americans are a very large part of the Spanish-speaking population in Florida as well. And the fear that the Democrats might be moving towards a more socialist approach is a huge concern for them, having fled Cuba. So that's gotten a lot of talk, in the domestic press about how that's going to go. But Florida is definitely behaving like a purple state. But if any of those states go to Trump, so here's Florida again. So Trump increases his chances considerably if that happens. But if it goes to Biden again, it's game over. Trump needs all of those borderline states. But here's the trick. Since Florida was involved in that year 2000 business, they start counting absentee votes immediately so that they don't run into the problem in the year 2000. Whereas in Pennsylvania, they are not allowed to touch those mail-in votes until it's 7:30 a.m. here in the U.S. as we're chatting. 24 hours from now will be morning in Pennsylvania. And they're not allowed to touch those mail-in votes until then. And it's going to take them multiple days to do it. And the number of mail-in votes is huge compared to the past because of COVID and safety reasons. So we're not going to learn very much about Pennsylvania in the next 36 hours. Whereas Florida, we should have the answer tomorrow night.
Is that unprecedented that an election could be delayed for several days, like the actual results? I mean,
well, there's all kinds of rules for it. So if it's within a half point, 1/2 of a percentage point, then most states will allow for a recount at that point. So the loser at that point, who has 49.5% of the vote, can force a recount, and that takes several days. But normally there's not a big delay other than that. But this year, everything's different. It's not just that, Trump is a bit of a character and, that, thing. It's not only that, it's also because of, COVID. So there have already been more votes cast the day before Election Day in most states than all of the votes last cycle.
The people are actually getting out and voting this time.
Yeah. So
you see it everywhere. Everyone's posting
go vote.
Yeah. And we see it everywhere else in the world as well. All over Reddit.
We're smacked with it constantly. Yeah, get out and vote. Like, I don't have a choice. I'm in Australia.
I can't vote.
No, but in our elections we have to vote. It's not a choice they make.
The other guy that we can briefly mention, and I don't know if he gets mentioned in the international press at all. He's really an interesting character because he did a video course. I'm a big fan of a company called The Great Courses. They're just professors standing in front of a podium giving these courses, but it's really interesting. And that's how I first heard this guy's name. So his name is Alan Lichtman, and he's about as different from Nate Silver as you can imagine. But he's been talking about his so-called keys to the White House for 30 years or something like that. And he's only been wrong once, but it depends on how you can say that he was wrong. He predicted that Gore would win in 2000. And of course, a lot of folks feel that Gore did win, but he didn't have anything in this formula to take into account the fact that it went to the Supreme Court and so on. But I don't know. I don't remember how many keys there are. I think there might be 17 or something. But what these are is just simple yes/no questions. Is the candidate incumbent? Yes or no, right? what happened in the last midterm election? So in other words, looking back, what happened in 2018? What is the economy like? Has there been a big controversy? Was the incumbent impeached, right? It's just a series of questions. And the only time he's been wrong in 30 years was year 2000.
Yeah, which of course is controversial in itself.
Yeah, here it goes. Keys are the 13 simple true or false questions. And he's predicting that Biden is going to win. But people have asked him about whether or not he should add a 14th key for COVID. He said, look, I'm a historian. I'm not a
futurist
fortune teller. He's doing this based on, because he looked at all the elections before that. And he's really an interesting guy. But because the keys don't change, they don't have the kind of drama that 538 has, because 538 you can check every day, but it's been incredibly stable, which was not true in 2016. That snake chart that I showed you was changing every day quite a bit, because there was a lot of stuff going on in the 2016 election that seemed to change momentum a few days before, and there really hasn't been anything equivalent to that. Of course, there's news and there's drama and people give speeches and there's debates, but the numbers have not changed very much for weeks and weeks and weeks, arguably for months. There were polls way back in March before Biden even won the primary where it was a what if Biden wins the primary, what would the numbers be? And you can potentially go back 6 months and you see those stable numbers. So I think when it's stable, that's when those polling averages really help. Whereas if it's volatile, maybe going with last night's poll maybe is better. So I think the current circumstances are aligned well with 538's approach. So we'll see.
Although I think the last night's polls were just as inaccurate with Hillary Clinton. Everyone was. I think that's where the controversy is that everyone was like, well, you told us she would win.
Yep.
Yeah, they were so sure of it.
But the kind of people who answers the polls is not a good cross-section of society anyway, I imagine. A lot of young people wouldn't answer these polls, etc.
Your comment does kind of raise this issue, which 538 has an article about. I won't show it to you, but I'll just kind of mention it. In 2016, the feeling was that maybe the polls were off because the notion of a shy Trump voter, somebody that would vote for Trump but not want to tell a pollster that they were that. So this has been something that people have been talking about. So they've done some research on it. And normally you can spot this kind of behavior if you give someone a more and less private way of voicing their opinion. So you have someone call them, and then you have an online poll where there's no other human that's involved. And you should notice a little bit of a shift. If you were to ask about something controversial, like drug legalization or something like that, then you can notice this difference, that when you ask someone on the phone, you ask someone in person, or it's anonymous, you'll get different answers. But they've done that, and they don't notice a difference when it's an online versus a human asking a question over the phone. So the evidence seems to be that this notion of the so-called shy Trump voter is a little bit overblown, but we'll know soon enough. So, for folks that are watching in the international press, what everybody's been saying here is keep your eye on Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida, particularly since those are in the East Coast. So just about 36 hours from now, we might know a little bit about North Carolina and Florida. But because Pennsylvania has this rule that they can't look at the mail-in votes, their absentee votes, until the election day, North Carolina and Florida is already processing them, but Pennsylvania is not. So everybody's been warned that Pennsylvania, although it's arguably the most important state of all in this current election cycle, it'll probably be Friday before we know about Pennsylvania, unless it's a really dramatic Biden gets 55% of the vote, and then we know.
But even still, I think, and a lot of people, especially Australians, I would say, are not aware of just how close it still is, right? Like this map here shows a Biden win, but it doesn't take much for a couple of these states within 5% to flip.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So let's just kind of experiment a little bit with what what kind of scenario would allow Trump to win. He's favored in Texas. So let's say he gets Texas. We said that North Carolina and Florida are critical, right? And notice that it's quite close in North Carolina. It's expected to be extremely close. Look at that. He's up to 30%. Give him Florida too. Arizona, notice it's pink. It favors Trump at the moment. In fact, 2-to-1 odds. You start to see, right, that he does have a path to victory there. So that's just 5 states, 2 of which, you see Biden's down to 2% now. So what's happening is they've got the 40,000 simulations, which is that other map that we saw with all the different scenarios. But what this is doing is saying how many of those 40,000 scenarios have these 5 going to Trump? And then they display the odds there. So again, this is not a nutty scenario at all, because North Carolina is right on the fence. Florida is famously Republican leaning. Texas is famously Republican leaning. Arizona typically is, but in this cycle is changing a little bit. And Trump won Pennsylvania the last time, and then all of a sudden, that's all he would need.
Yeah. People are definitely not aware of just how close this election is.
Yeah.
Even still.
In the same scenario, by the way, Biden could still be winning by 2 million, 3 million, 4 million votes. I was just watching some coverage in the domestic news this morning, actually. That was probably it was a recording from just a couple of days old, where an expert in this said that he had come up with a scenario where Biden could win by 6 or 7 million votes and still lose in the Electoral College. Wow.
Yeah.
All right, Keith. Well, thank you for the second time.
Yeah, that was a really good conversation. I think illuminating on polls and stats for election results, which I think is important because people don't understand them.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I thought it was a lot of fun.
Cool. Thanks, Keith.
All right. Cheers, Keith.
I'll see you then.
You've made it to the end of another episode of Tech Society. Thanks for listening. I hope that was enlightening. Make sure you check out 538. It is a really informative and really interesting website. And on this day in tech history, the space race was heating up. November 3rd, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first Earthling into orbit, and it was not a human. Sputnik 2 held within it a Siberian husky named Laika, who sadly only survived a few hours into the flight and died from stress and overheating. The Soviets had never planned to bring Laika back to Earth, as the Sputnik 2 did not have deorbiting or re-entry technology designed into it. Poor Laika, the first dog shot into space. We salute you, Laika. Your sacrifice has not gone unnoticed. And that's it from John and I. We will be watching the election with a bated breath, and we hope to come back to you with good news. Bye everybody, hope you're having a marvelous week. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure you head over to the website and sign up to our newsletter. To all our American listeners, make sure you get out and vote.